So without any further ado, the number one greatest match in SummerSlam history is Bret the Hitman Hart. There's that name again. Bret the Hitman Hart against Owen Hart, brother versus brother, inside a steel cage for the World Wrestling Federation Championship at SummerSlam 1994. This show was held at the then brand new United Center in Chicago, which had just opened up 11 days earlier. SummerSlam was the first major show to be held inside that building, and it would not be until a house show last year in 2018 that they would even come back to that building. Which is very strange that they have not run a major show there since this pay-per-view, and I can only assume it has to do with the cost, maybe, of running the venue compared to the Allstate Arena, which is sort of their home base in Chicago. Probably the same reason they run the Barclays Center in Brooklyn all the time now, and rarely do they run any big shows anyway in Madison Square Garden. You know, these Raw and SmackDown tapings that are coming up in MSG next month as I am recording this, that's the first time they're doing TV in those buildings in a decade. So this was only the second WWE match ever to get the vaunted 5-star rating from the Wrestling Observer, for those who care about that sort of thing. The first one was earlier that very same year, the ladder match between Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon from WrestleMania 10. So business may have been on a downturn that year, but they had some great wrestling in that company in 94. I like this match better than their first match at WrestleMania that year. Bret and Owen opened up WrestleMania, still, in my opinion, the greatest opening match ever to a WrestleMania. Is Bret versus Owen in 94. It's better than Eddie and, I think it was Eddie and Ray, and even Triple H and Daniel Bryan. They had a tremendous match at WrestleMania 30. Bret versus Owen, to me, is still number one in that spot. And I like this match better than I like that one. And this match here, and not just this match here, but this is now, I believe, the third time in this top 10 that Bret Hart has appeared. He also was in the number 2 spot last week against the British Bulldog from Wembley Stadium. And I had him at number 4 for the SummerSlam 91 Icy match with Mr. Perfect. Bret Hart is Mr. SummerSlam. I've said this before. I will reiterate it here. 3 appearances in this countdown alone. But you could easily throw in some of those honorable mentions I just mentioned a little while ago. 89 against the Brainbusters. 90 against Demolition. 93. Look at the sum of its parts in 93. Don't just look at 93 and go, oh, he wrestled Doink. Or, oh, he wrestled Jerry Lawler in what I think was a pretty short match. Look at the sum of its parts in 93. That whole thing was one giant angle. And I thought it was very well done. The Bret stuff was the best stuff on that entire show. The match with Doink was pretty good. Give Doink some credit. He was a great wrestler. And then when Jerry Lawler revealed that he wasn't really hurt, because that was supposed to be the original match, he came out on crutches. He revealed that he wasn't really hurt. He hit Bret with the crutch, and all of a sudden we got the second match, and just that whole feud was just fantastic stuff. 95, Bret wrestled Lawler's evil dentist, and I don't remember that one being particularly good, so that was a misfire. 96, he was out. And then he had the match with The Undertaker in 97, which is memorable for the finish, and Bret winning his 5th world title. The only thing is, he may be Mr. SummerSlam, but he can never quite say it the right way. It was always the SummerSlam with Bret Hart, which I laugh every time I hear him say it. It's like, at the SummerSlam, in the SummerSlam. Like, same thing when he went to WCW. It wasn't WCW. It was the WCW. I'm going to sign with the WCW. He loved putting that extra word in there. That's one thing I've noticed over all these years. So let's quickly recap this feud and how we got here. Because there was a time where Bret was adamant on television as part of the storyline. Under no circumstances whatsoever would I ever wrestle my brother Owen. Not ever. Well, I mean, he's just a giant pink liar now, isn't he? Dates back to Survivor Series in 93. Jerry Lawler had tormented the Hart family. He had tormented Stu and Helen. He had insulted them at every turn. Helen is old enough to remember when the Dead Sea was just sick. All of these one-liners. merciless with the jokes on TV. Laughed my ass off. And he attacked Bret during his King of the Ring coronation in 93. That's where this whole thing started between the two of them. So it was to have led to a match at Survivor Series that year. It was going to be Bret Hart and his brothers against Jerry Lawler and his Knights. Then Lawler got arrested, and they brought back Shawn Michaels from the little suspension that he had been on. And it was Shawn Michaels and the Knights, which made no sense. Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid, teaming with a bunch of guys dressed up as medieval knights. Makes no sense. That'd be like me having an Ewok as my co-host. If I had a Star Wars podcast, maybe. Otherwise, it would just be fucking weird. So in that match, Owen hits the ropes. He inadvertently bangs into Bret, who's on the apron, and Bret just gets launched off the apron into the steel barricade. And all the brothers rush over to check on him, and Owen is distracted, and Owen gets rolled up and pinned. He's the only Hart brother to have been eliminated in that match, and that is what started the rift between the two brothers. They patched things up in time for Christmas. Everything's great. We're back on the same page. They even challenged for the tag team titles at the Royal Rumble that year, only for Bret to suffer a knee injury and cost them the match. Owen then famously kicked Bret's leg out of his leg, and it led to their first match at WrestleMania 10, which Owen won. Later that same night, Bret won back the championship, and Owen just could hardly stand it. Even when he wins, he loses. Always in the shadow of Big Brother Bret. So, he set out to prove, whatever his brother can do, I can do better. And like Bret the year before, he went out and he won the King of the Ring. With a little bit of help from Bret's old tag team partner, Jim the Anvil Neidhart. And I love how this whole story played out. Anvil just came back out of nowhere. And Anvil came back in Bret's corner when Bret wrestled Diesel that night in a champion against champion match. Anvil was there to counteract Shawn Michaels at ringside. He was outside the ring, but then he interfered. Right when it looked like Diesel had the match won, he had just given Bret the jackknife powerbomb. And in came the Anvil, and he attacked Diesel, and the referee rang the bell, and Bret was disqualified. And we would find out later on, he only did that to ensure that Bret would keep the belt so that Owen could take it from him. It's a big swerve. He didn't come back with Bret. He came back with Owen, his former tag team partner, because the two of them were a team also for a while. They were the New Foundation, which didn't last very long. Oh, and by the way, on the way to SummerSlam, Owen Hart won the WWF title. Kind of. 2 weeks before their match at SummerSlam, there was a house show in Portland, Maine. It was taped for a Coliseum video called Wham Bam Body Slam. Bret and Owen wrestled for the championship in a lumberjack match. Jim Neidhart interfered in that match. Referee did not see it. And Owen pinned Bret 1, 2, 3 to win the championship. All the heel lumberjacks immediately flooded into the ring. They hoisted Owen up onto their shoulders as he held up the title proudly until another referee, it might have been Mike Chioda, another referee came down from the back to show the first referee what had happened and that the Anvil had interfered. And the referee restarted the match. And eventually Bret Hart won and he retained the title. But the footage is out there, and so for a good 60 seconds or so, Owen Hart was the WWF champion. And see, I would have kept the title on Owen and had him drop it back to Bret in the cage at SummerSlam. I mean, what's the harm? What would have been the harm in doing that? If anything, you could have used it to help explain the cage stipulation. It's meant to keep the Anvil out of the match. He interfered in Portland. It cost Bret the championship. And so you could have said, now we have this cage, or now the cage takes on a whole new meaning because we have to keep this man out to make sure that we don't have a repeat of what happened 5 days earlier. And they even came into this match. Todd Pettengill mentioned that Bret Hart was suffering or recovering from a case of strep throat. They could have mentioned that too and said Bret lost the championship. He came into that match. He was sick as a dog. He wasn't feeling well. I mean, hindsight is what it is. I look back now, I'm like, would it have really killed them to put the title on Owen, even if it was only for 5 days? Well, they could have if they wanted to. And sadly, WWE does not recognize Owen's blink and you missed it title reign. But what a year that would have been for him. Imagine that, if he would have held on to that championship. I talked in the mailbag about the lost Royal Rumble match at Madison Square Garden that Owen won 5 days before the Rumble pay-per-view that year in 94. Right? Imagine, he wins that Rumble match, which he did. Then he beats Bret at WrestleMania, which he did. Then he wins King of the Ring, which he did. Then he could have won the world title. I mean, he could have retired after that. It was all downhill from there. So going into this pay-per-view, we had Tatanka accusing Lex Luger on TV every week of selling out to the $1 Million Man, only for them to do the big swerve here and reveal that it was Tatanka who sold out all along. I like that angle. And we had DiBiase bringing back a fake Undertaker, who then had a match with the real Undertaker, who had been missing since the Royal Rumble. Riveting stuff. Great thing about the sibling rivalry stuff with Bret and Owen is that it's something people can relate to, which is one of the reasons I love this storyline so much. Randy Savage was used as the Master of Ceremonies at SummerSlam that year. This would be his last pay-per-view with them before leaving for WCW. So the entire Hart family is sitting at ringside. Back in the company is the British Bulldog. He's got his wife Dianna with him in the front row. That would come into play later on. Stu and Helen are at ringside fermenting or whatever. Bruce Hart was there with his trusty leather jacket that I always saw him in whenever he would make a frickin' appearance on television. He was always in that leather jacket. And sitting directly behind Bruce was Jim the Anvil Neidhart, wearing sunglasses. And Bruce kept turning around and giving him grief. You better not interfere. And Bobby Heenan once said, "You had 9 months, and the best you could come up with is Bruce." I will never forget that line as long as I live. So with all those family members at ringside, the cage stipulation was really as much to keep all of them out, including the Anvil, as much as it was to keep Bret and Owen on the inside. So these two played up the drama of the cage escape stipulation better than any cage match I have ever seen in my life. This was during a period where pinfalls and submissions in WWF cage matches did not count. They could not take place inside the cage. The only way to win was to climb out and have both feet touch the floor. So between that handicap and the no blood rule that was enforced at the time, Bret said that they had to rely on the constant attempts to escape the cage as a way to build drama. So if you watch this match back, and I encourage everybody listening to do so, you will notice that there's probably no less than 25 different attempts at escaping the cage. And that was one of the reasons why there were so many of them, because they didn't have, you couldn't attempt a pinfall. You could not attempt a submission. You couldn't get color. All these things that normally you might do in a cage match, they couldn't do. They had to try to create other avenues to really build the drama. And I know the wrestlers back then were not very fond of that blue bar cage. They've talked about how much it hurt. I still prefer it to the mesh one. I mean, it's easy for me to say because I didn't have to work in it, but I prefer that blue bar cage to the mesh ones that they use today. You cannot replicate the sound of throwing somebody into the blue steel. And it's easier to climb, too. Like, you can never do the finish they did here in this match with a mesh cage. It's just not possible. Owen attacks Bret right as he enters the cage, and just like that, we're off to the races. A few minutes in, Bret tries to crawl out the door. Owen drags him back in. Owen then tries to dive out of the ring, and Bret drags him in. Owen starts chewing on his brother's finger, trying to break his grip as Bret is pulling at Owen's face. This felt like two brothers fighting. I know that feeling because I've had fights like this before with my own brother when I was younger. Just not in a cage. But the fighting and the biting and all that, absolutely. So a good deal of this match, as I said before, is them attempting to climb out. It's the only way to win. So that's the kind of match they put together. How can we come up with different ways to tell this story? Now, if you are the kind of person who thinks that that's boring, or you think, well, how many times can we watch these guys try to climb out of the cage before it gets boring? Tell that to the crowd, because they were hanging on to every attempt to climb up and over that cage. The crowd heat for this match, pretty much all the way through, was incredible. Bret tries to climb out. Owen stops him. He yanks him down, and Bret crotches himself on the top rope so hard, I don't see how he could have had children again after that, even if he wanted to. That was a nasty fall that he took. On one attempt, Owen was over the cage, and Bret had him by the hair, and Owen was just dangling, trying to fall to the floor. Owen hit a great pile driver, dead center of the ring, almost makes it out. Bret stirs at the last second, makes the save. Owen knocks Bret to the mat, but then Owen crotches himself on the top rope. So I guess no more Hart babies. And this is one of my favorite parts of the match. Bret is trying to crawl out the door. Owen will not let him. He is like an annoying gnat, like a bug. He will not go away. And Bret is kicking at him, and he's trying to reach out the door, and he's trying everything to break free, and Owen will not let go. And Bret, he is kicking Owen, or trying to kick him off, with such ferocity. You would think he was really pissed off at this guy. So he just comes back inside. He starts wailing away on Owen with right hands. Just machine gun right hands. Then he tries to quickly scurry out of the cage again, and again, Owen stops him. And so Bret slingshots him into the cage. More attempts to escape, foiled. Owen catches Bret with a spinning heel kick. He tries to climb out. Bret catches him at the top. They're in the very corner of the ring, on the top of the cage. And Bret delivers one of the most awesome-looking superplexes that you will ever see. He was he gave it a little extra bounce before he actually took flight. And it didn't look like a very happy landing for either one of these guys. But Owen drags him to the center of the ring. He puts him in the sharpshooter. And Owen looks dead into the camera and he cries he's going to break his leg. I'm going to break his legs, he says. Bret, though, reaches behind. He pulls Owen's leg out from underneath him and manages to reverse it into a sharpshooter of his own. Huge reaction for this. Of course, there's no submissions, so it's not like the match can end. Owen climbs up and over. Bret climbs up and over after him, and now both men are on the outside of the cage. And I'd say maybe midway down, Owen gets his foot stuck in one of the holes in the cage. And he drops. And he hangs upside down, which allows Bret to jump off the side panel and fall to the floor for a big win to a thunderous ovation. A great finish to an absolutely fantastic match. After the match, Jim Neidhart hops the barricade. So none of the family members see this. They're all celebrating. And in the case of Bulldog and Dianna, they're in the front row. And Anvil was probably sitting in the fourth row. So when Anvil hops over the barricade, he's crouching down like he's planning something very evil. Bulldog and Dianna, they can't see him. They're clapping, they're applauding Bret's big win. And Anvil sneaks up from behind them and he clotheslines the Bulldog. But the Bulldog grabs his wife or bumps into her or whatever. They both tumble over the barricade. They both basically got clotheslined over the barricade. Dianna, it looks like her head, I don't think it did, but it looked like her head on the rotation over may have smacked the metal guardrail. Like, it looked like she took a bad bump. And I love the hell out of this. I just thought, dramatically speaking, this was fantastic. And so Anvil goes over, he's choking out Bret with his shirt, and he and Owen put Bret back in the cage, and Anvil reaches into his pants. And he's about to pull something out. Thankfully, it was only a padlock. And he takes that padlock and he tries to, he's gonna lock the door. He's gonna chain the door. He's having a little bit of trouble though. And Bruce is trying to rip the door open. And it's the funniest thing because Anvil is, he's basically saying, wait a minute, like let me do this. Let me finish locking the door, please. Finally, he does lock the door. So now the only way for the Hart brothers to get in is to try to climb over. And Owen he took his boot off. I believe Owen took his shoe off. And he was using that as a weapon on Bret. And all the brothers are just trying to climb in. And every time they try, Owen punches him in the gut and this guy falls. Or Anvil hits one. Anvil hits Bulldog in the midsection. The Bulldog falls. And this goes on for a while until finally the Bulldog just takes his shirt off and says, the hell with this. And he manages to get inside. Owen just bails out of the cage. Anvil's right behind him, but he's kind of lagging behind, and Bulldog gets his hands on Anvil's foot. He rips his sneaker off, but Anvil manages to escape, and the two of them leave together. Bret says in his book that he and Owen were furious about Dianna taking that bump over the guardrail with Davey. It sounds like something Davey either just came up with Anvil, or Davey and Dianna may have come up with it and wanted to do it, but nobody clued in Bret and Owen, and when they saw that, they were very upset. And maybe that was because their parents were sitting right there, and that's their daughter. Or maybe they just felt like, she's not a trained wrestler and she shouldn't be taking bumps. I don't know, but he said that he and Owen both were very upset. Bruce Prichard, on his podcast, said that Undertaker was hot about this match going long. This match went about 32 minutes. And I guess it went long, and it took time away from his match with The Undertaker. Boy, does that sound weird. That sounds like I misspoke, but I really didn't. The Undertaker was very unhappy that there was time shaved off of his match with The Undertaker. And I guess they may have had the cage match earmarked for 20 or so minutes, but again, it went over 30. And whatever it was, Undertaker, according to Prichard, confronted Bret about it backstage. Nobody else saw this. Nobody else heard what was said. This is all according to Prichard. But it would not be the only time that somebody has shared a story of Undertaker having words backstage with Bret Hart. Kevin Nash, in one of his shoot interviews with Sean Oliver, when talking about why he left for WCW, said that Bret refused to take his jackknife in the cage match that they had at the In Your House show in February of '96. This was right before WrestleMania 12. And Nash and Undertaker, they were going to be the semi-main event at WrestleMania that year, behind the Iron Man match. And they both wanted to do a finish in this cage match that Diesel had with Bret that would give, it would have him giving Bret the jackknife, and Diesel's got the match won, and all of a sudden the Undertaker would come up from underneath the ring, and he would drag Diesel down to hell, which is what happened. But Bret just absolutely refused to take the jackknife. He felt that for Diesel to use his finish and have the match won, it made him look weak. Bret felt it made himself look weak. And in the shoot, Nash said that Undertaker is sitting there, I guess, listening to this. And Undertaker just goes, "Motherfucker, it isn't always about you." He said Bret was losing to Shawn at Mania anyway. This is Nash now. And he felt that he and The Undertaker needed that. They needed that finish to go down the way that Nash wanted it to go down to keep their own stuff. Nash and Undertaker, to keep their own program strong. Here's a guy who was moments away from winning the championship, and The Undertaker cost him a surefire championship win. That's what they were going for. And once Vince McMahon decided that we're going to go with Bret, we're going to go with the way that Bret wants to do it, we're going to go with the original plan, we're going to do it Bret's way. And Nash said at that point his mind was made up. At that moment, he was already on the fence, he was already thinking about leaving, but at that moment he said his mind was made up. And he went to Scott Hall later that night and he said, "Hey, talk to Bischoff and get me a deal too." Because he was done. He was done. It was the money that caused him to leave, but I guess that was just the final straw for him. Bret said in his book that he doesn't think that this is the best cage match, but it's the best cage match without blood. I agree with that last part, but I disagree that it isn't the best cage match in WWE. I actually think he's selling it short. I believe it is. Not counting Hell in a Cell, because that's a different type of cage match. That has a roof on it. You take away the cage escape rule and all the drama that goes along with it, no matter how goofy you may think it is. And I know the cage escape thing was always a WWF thing. It never really worked that way in other promotions. No matter what you think of it, though, it's why I rank them separately. It's not a cop-out. Hell in a Cell matches are inherently different than the way that old WWF cage matches used to be. They're just two different types of matches. Now, if you included Hell in a Cell matches, it's either this or the very first Hell in a Cell with Shawn and The Undertaker as being the best cage match in company history.